Good morning, everybody. My clock says straight up 10 o'clock. We will be having this training webinar on biosecurity planning for fairs and exhibitions. I'd like to invite everyone, as they have questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat box. I have my cohorts, Larry Trannell and Jen Bentley, who will help us put this questions together so everybody has a chance. If they can. Our presenter today is Danelle Bickett Weddle with Preventalytics. She's a veterinarian with over 25 years of experience promoting livestock health. She has developed biosecurity guidance for dairy, beef, and sheep industries. The company she founded, Preventalytics, focuses on practical implementation of steps to protect cattle and caretaker health. With the advent of the FAIRS order from the state veterinary, we knew that a lot of fairs didn't have biosecurity plans and felt that this was in fact something that most of these counties at least needed some bullet points to kind of make sure they got what they needed. As I always say, Danelle, the podium is yours.
Thanks so much, Fred. Appreciate the opportunity to connect with everybody. Just want to say today is very discussion based. So if you have questions, please type those in. I've got it up and I'll kind of be peeking at that. We also, if you've been to one exhibition, you've been to one exhibition, right? The next one looks different. The next county fair looks different. So a lot of the information I want to present to you gives you kind of a guideline of maybe some of the risk areas. We all know everybody's risk tolerance is different. So my goal is to give you the reason why we're doing this, give you some resources to try and address some of the concerns. There's a lot of things out there for biosecurity for fairs. So we'll give you pointers on that. And then I'm all about practicality. So there'll be some practical pointers throughout as well. So appreciate the introduction, Fred, and I just want to let everybody know that the resources that you're going to see today are all publicly available. So you'll have access to them. I've got web links, I've got QR codes, all of that on the screen. Also, the opinions that you're going to hear from me are mine and mine alone. I do not represent Iowa State University, the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, or USDA. So I will be sharing information from all of them, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands the context in which I'm sharing info today. We do have a quick poll. So Jen, if you're able to go ahead and deploy that, this will kind of help me understand where our audience is. So if you just want to click on what best describes your professional interest in today's webinar, then I'll know how deep maybe to go into some areas and how many things we might just skim over, just depending on who's in our audience today. So just take a few minutes there. It should pop up on the screen for you. And,
yep, it looks like people are filling it out. Got about 50 people already selected that. So we'll give them a few more seconds here and then we'll share that.
Great. Excellent.
And if there's something that I didn't list in the options, go ahead and put it in the chat if you're something other than what I put in there for the poll question. But it looks like we pretty well got our responses, so I'll go ahead and share that. So can you see that, Danelle?
Yeah, I can. All right. And the audience should be able to see that as well. So county youth coordinators, biggest audience, extension educators, and then county fair. So excellent. Really appreciate that. Okay. All right. Well, given that, here are two county youth. One I'm directly related to and one is her good friend. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of stage setting, this influenza A H5N1, what it is, why we should care, what some of the concerns are. Then we'll talk about the IDALS order for dairy exhibitions, I will specifically address biosecurity and biosecurity only. We do have some partners on from iDolls, and at the end of today's session, if there are questions that don't pertain to biosecurity, our colleagues there will be able to address those for you. We're going to talk about biosecurity for fairs, protecting what I call the two-leggeds and the four-legged. So protecting animals and protecting people, and then a ton of resources shared throughout this whole presentation. Okay, so this next thing is kind of messy, but really what I want to set the stage on is influenza A, how it's named, because you'll hear all kinds of numbers thrown out there and it's kind of confusing. So there's two things on the virus. If you look at it under a microscope, there's proteins that stick out, right? So those H's and A's or HA's and NA's have numbers, and there's all kinds of combinations. So you can see on the screen all the different species that get this. There's mammals that live in the water that get it, bats. So we had to up our numbers on H's because of bat species. So again, all kinds of animals are susceptible to an influenza A. And then things can mix, right? So this virus has mixture issues. And like anything, right? It wants to live, so it's going to change itself to, outwit the next host. So that's why this disease has been around in the news for a really long time. You see people are on this chart as well, because humans, right? Influenza A is something that we deal with every winter season. When we talk specifically about this HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza in birds, the H5s and the H7s are the two that we're concerned with. This H5N1 has been here in the United States, this current one, since February of 2022 in poultry. So things that you're hearing about, right? And then all of a sudden in March, we saw clinical signs in February, but in March, that's where that little green cow comes in. We started seeing cases in dairy. Okay, so I want to thank my friend, Dr. Marie Colhane. This is a graphic we got, and then she just added the little green cow. Okay, so H5N1 in commercial poultry. You can go to the USDA website, and again, all of that stuff is on the screen. But right now, if you look over the last 30 days, that's what this sorts for. The cases that we're seeing in Minnesota and Iowa are significant, right? So we're seeing flocks come down with H5N1. Since the beginning of this outbreak, once it started in 2022, 97 million birds have been affected, 1,150 flocks in 48 states. So again, this is, some big numbers on why this disease is so significant in so many states, right? Minnesota and Iowa produce, Minnesota's #1 in turkeys, Iowa's #1 in layers. So again, this is why we're focused on this. Okay, now I'm going to show you this graphic, and you might be looking at it like, oh my gosh, there's so much on here. All right, so we're going to walk through it a little bit. These are all the alphabet soups, right? This is basically, if you were involved in the show world, right? You've got your granddam and grandsire and, all the tree, right? So this is how nitty gritty we get when it comes to this virus, is we know all the way down to its little tiny fingerprint. So that's why you see all these names. So waterfowl have had it, it reassorts, right? That's the mixture that happens. That happened in an unknown host to get to where we're at today. We started finding this particular strain all the way down to its fingerprint. January saw some reports in Wyoming, California in wild birds in February, New Mexico saw it in a skunk in February. It went through some unknown host. Why is it unknown? Well, we don't have all the samples in the world, right, to be able to pinpoint it. But what we do know is come February, March, we started seeing it in lactating dairy cattle. And then retrospectively, we went, oh wait, there were dead birds on these farms. There were also dead cats, dead skunks, dead possums on these farms. So we know the mammal species are definitely susceptible. So the thing that we're looking at now is it's in dairy cattle, and then how is it spreading? We'll talk a little bit more about this, but by the fingerprint, we can see that it's spreading once it gets into an area to local dairies through fomites. contaminated inanimate objects like trailers, feet of, boots and that kind of stuff go into new farms. So it's spreading between the farms, and this depicts that what we call phylogenetic tree, the fancy word for how do we look at the fingerprint of the virus. We also know we've had 3 human workers that are affected. Okay, so right now, the biggest lactating animal that we are seeing this in is dairy cattle. So the question is, does this affect dairy goats? We do not have reports at this time that it affects dairy goats. The goat cases that happened in Minnesota in January, February were in kid goats, and they were neurologic, meaning they had brain symptoms and died, which is what we commonly see. That's what we're seeing in cats, possums, skunks, raccoons, all of that. That's normally how this thing appears, but it jumps into a lactating dairy cow and goes, yippee, we've got cells that replicate like crazy in an udder, right? So the potential is there for dairy goats, but right now we've not seen any reports in dairy goats, but watch them, right? Watch them just as closely as you would our dairy cattle. Okay. So what are the different effects? And this becomes important to me when I think about fairs, right? Because, oh my gosh, we're getting so excited. The kids are ramped up. They're ready to go to the fair. We've got all these species, right? So we know waterfowl like ducks and geese carry this virus and they shed it, but they don't get sick. They just spew it all over the environment. We also know wild birds can be carriers and it can also be deadly. That's what we saw on our dairies, and continue to see dead wild birds like grackles, pigeons, those kinds of things. Poultry, it's deadly. You don't need very many virus particles to kill these turkeys, layers, broilers, all of that. Humans, in 2024, we've had 3 cases, 2 with red eyes, 1 with kind of cough and fatigue. All have recovered, but humans have receptors for this poultry strain, which we've been watching in the poultry for a very long time. We're not seeing human receptor things in the dairy cattle one, but we are seeing a few cases in humans. Mentioned cats and raccoons, it's been deadly. We had goats, and it was deadly, not the same exact strain, but we did see dead dairy goats, neurologic. Dairy cattle, lost milk, decreased appetite, fevers, maybe, right? Not always, changes in manure. Alpacas, oh my goodness. Now we've had a report of alpacas on a poultry farm in Idaho, and in talking with the state vet, respiratory signs. They had 1 adult male that got neurologic kind of brain issues and died, and they did find the virus in its brain. Abortions, that's been kind of the latest report. There was 18 alpacas on this farm, and so far they've had 6 reported abortions. So they're finding it, in milk and in nasal secretions. Where else did he tell me? The brain, some environmental samples around where these alpacas are. Beef cattle and pigs. So pigs, you saw on that chart, pigs get their own type of influenza A. They are susceptible to this. Tests are being conducted. It happened down in Texas a lot. They were looking for this virus. And if anybody's concerned, you can talk with your herd veterinarian and decide if that's a test that needs to be done. But again, beef cattle and pigs to date don't have any reported symptoms or impact. Okay. So I don't know if you guys have ever done the 6 versus 9 trick. So depending on what angle you're looking at that number that is before you on the screen, right? The poultry, you're going to see a 9, or the dairy, you're going to see a 6, right? And that is something I wanted to share today about the different perspectives of how we're looking at this virus. Depends on what lens you're coming at it. So from a poultry's perspective, they see that virus, they see that number 9 and go, oh my gosh, this could kill us, right? Kind of scary, right? And for producers that care for those animals, also kind of scary. Well, the lactating dairy cow goes, wow, this 6 could make me sick, right? So same virus, just presents itself differently. And again, how do you manage that when you've got all these species and people that care for them coming with very different perspectives? What I want to share with you today is right now the enemy is that 6 or 9. It's that virus. It's not each other's industries. It's not regulators. It's not your veterinarian. It's not those other show folks, right? The enemy is the virus. And when you can't see your enemy, because those viruses are tiny, it's challenging sometimes and it's scary for people. So everybody's going to come at this with a different risk tolerance and perception, right? So as you're thinking about planning for fairs and, talking with people about what some of the risks are, recognize there's going to be a lot of variation. So as someone offering fairs and working with kids and working with open shows and that kind of stuff, offer opportunities to mitigate risk and give people the opportunity to do more if they need it. Okay, so what are we seeing in H5N1 in dairy cattle? So from March 25th, that's when it was first diagnosed by USDA, to the latest report, which was June 28th, Friday. There's been 132 dairy herds in 12 states. And you look at this map and you're like, oh, she has no ability to count. This is the last 30 days. So we have had 4 states clear. So no new cases in New Mexico, Kansas, Ohio, or North Carolina in the last 30 days. So you can sort if you want to see from the beginning of the outbreak. But right now, this is kind of the picture that we're looking at. In the state of Iowa, our first diagnosed case was June 7th. And to date, there's been 11 herds on testing reported here on the system. So how is it spreading? I think this is a cool graphic. I'm a very visual learner, so I hope for those folks that some of these give you that same snapshot. So the virus data, so it's fingerprint. USDA shares that with the world, with the researchers looking at this, because this is a worldwide disease, right? So modelers took that and said, okay, what do we know about its fingerprint? Oh, well, we know it started in the panhandle of Texas. We saw early reports in New Mexico where it butts up against the panhandle. So on March 13th, right, if we think about it kind of brewing in this area, we didn't know what it was. We didn't have a name for it yet. We just knew dairy cattle were sick. Then based on how the virus showed up in different places as we tested dairy herds in Michigan, Kansas, New Mexico, we can see where it was moved to those areas. And then it continued. So we had a Kansas to Idaho link. We had Michigan and backwards and to Michigan. We had a Texas to Ohio link. The whole Michigan, North Carolina, South Dakota, right? Like it doesn't necessarily mean like dairy cattle were all of the movements, but that's what the virus tells us. If we're like, if you guys ever played that game as a kid where you flip over the cards and you're looking for matches, right? That's kind of what the researchers do with this virus fingerprint is like, it was Professor, whoever in the library with a candlestick, right? We're trying to put all those clues together. So that's really what this shows us. When we look at what's happening today, so again, this data set ended in April. Since this report or this publication came out, and it's called a preprint, but since it came out, we're seeing a lot of local spread happening, especially in Michigan. So the most epi data we've got, epi data means somebody gets infected and then they work with people to answer a bunch of questions to figure out where might it have come from. So a report was put out by USDA a couple of weeks ago that looked at that local spread. So we are seeing the spread between dairies and poultry in Michigan, which, when we start thinking about Iowa, causes my heart to skip a beat a little bit. Okay, so how does disease spread? Well, animals in this case may not always show obvious signs of disease. In fact, when we do what we call serial bulk tank tests, so we're looking at the bulk tank over a period of time for a herd, and some of the data that we're seeing is that, wow, we start to pick up virus in the milk before we necessarily see that we have sick cows. So this is what we call an infected but undetected, right? So if I go out as a veterinarian and I'm looking over your cows, I don't see anything. They're not telling you they're sick, but we're seeing that, right? We are seeing some early changes in somatic cell count, all that. By the time we're picking it up in our herds, right, we've got quite a bit of virus there. So if I was gonna look for a disease and I know this, what would I look in? Milk, right? It's a great medium. So that's why so much testing happens around milk. Well, we know animal to animal spread happens in this case, right? And you put animals, / poultry, right? It's also a zoonotic potential disease, right? That means it can go from animals to humans. Now, there's a lot of viruses out there that people can give to critters and vice versa, and bacteria and all that. So zoonotic diseases happen in livestock. We know that. But this virus has, shown us that as well. So if you have to be exposed to the virus to get sick, then our biosecurity needs to focus on all those ways of preventing exposure. So what do we see in lactating dairy cows? Sudden drop in feed intake and decreased rumination. So if they have rumen monitors, they're seeing this on their data charts that, she just kind of tanked and went off feed. Clear nasal discharge, right? So in the pictures you see on the screen came out of this publication, it's clear. It's not, you wouldn't think of it as, snot necessarily, right? But just more clear discharge. And then milk production just tanks. Some of them are at 100 pounds one day and 0 the next. 10 to 20% of a herd seems to have these types of signs. More of those severe cases will have what we call that thick colostrum milk. So the pictures here show you on a CMT paddle what the flakes look like, and then in the samples how thick some of that milk gets. So it's very, very odd looking, right? It's a mastitis type appearance, which we haven't seen before in viruses. So, kind of blew our minds. Manure, variable, right? It might be tacky, might be loose. Cows are, lethargic, they're dehydrated, some fevers. It depends on how early in the cases we're catching them, right? So fevers are there, but not always. But when we test that milk, we're finding millions of viral particles, right? These cows are just like factories producing a lot of virus. And again, some of this happens before clinical signs appear. So when we think about a lactating dairy cow and all the ways that things come in and out of her, right? Because if we have to be exposed or an animal has to be exposed, I need to know, like, what are all the ways that this virus might be moving? So these are all the ways anything could get in or out. So what have we learned through testing? We've learned that we can find virus in nasal secretions, not always, but we can, depends on how early she is in the infection. We are finding reports in urine. We're finding lots of virus in milk. That was a given. And we've also, and I say we collectively, so USDA's Ag Research Service, ARS, will be publishing an article about how they gave it to a cow through the teat orifice and to see if they could replicate this disease, and they certainly did. So we know we can find virus in all those places. Now, feces, which comes out in volumes on dairies, right? And in birds, we know in poultry, we can find it in their feces, but in cows, we're just not consistently finding it. And when we do, there's been suspect, like, did we actually contaminate it with raw milk, right? So feces is not as big of a concern right now with the data we have as a spreader of this virus. We still need more research to know, can a lactating dairy cow breathe it in or breathe it out, right? We don't know that. The ARS was able to infect heifers, non-lactating, and see some signs in their lungs after they gave it to them in the nose. But again, they weren't lactating, so they didn't show the clinical signs that we're seeing in our lactating cows. And then the mouth, right? Do we know if she eats feed contaminated or drinks water contaminated or licking whatever in the environment? Is that a route? We haven't been able to repeat that, but it's suspect. So just kind of keep those in mind. So if I'm going to protect this cow or the humans that handle her, these are the things I'm going to focus on. So to humans, CDC working through local public health. So your county level public health, CDC is not going to come knocking on any dairy door, right? It's your local public health that works with the dairies. So if the farm wants to, know where their employees' exposures are, they're doing free testing. So since this started in March until June of 2022, CDC is tracking folks for those 10 days after exposure. What have they found? Well, they've monitored almost 800 people. They've tested at least 53 of them because they had some type of sign that might indicate this flu. They found, I apologize, that should say 3 cases of H5N1. So 2 folks with red eyes in Texas, and 1 that had cough in Michigan. Boy, I need to fix that slide. I apologize. I was making modifications and I missed something there. So if eyeballs gross you out like they do me, turn away, but I want to show you what we mean by red eyes. We call it conjunctivitis. So this is the actual first patient in Texas, and how injected those eyes are. My gosh, it makes me want to rub my eyes this morning and get some Visine. So this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So this is monitoring in folks that have very close contact with people. You're like, wait a second, all I hear is it's not a risk to public health. You're right. So the risk to the general public, if you're not out taking care of cows that are infected, your risk is very low, right? We have pasteurization. FDA continues to prove that that is a safe way to consume milk. So pasteurized milk is safe. Cooking meat, right? Again, all of those safety things that we've enjoyed milk pasteurization for 100 years continue to protect us. We're continuing to do surveillance, but the humans that have close contact is really what the focus is on. So CDC has got resources available in English and Spanish. They just put this one out not that long ago. And it talks about how might I get infected if a cow is shedding this virus, right? If I touch something and then I touch my eyes or my mouth, all those mucous membranes, if I get milk splashed, we found it in urine. They don't have a picture of urine on here or anything like that. But again, we want to protect those eyes and nose and mouth. So for our workers, that becomes important, which for other things, our workers are protecting themselves, wearing goggles or wearing face shields or anything like that. So same rules apply in this case. Okay, so that brings us to the IDALS order. So this was issued last week. It takes effect today, and it goes through dairy exhibitions in Iowa and their testing requirements and how to involve your USDA accredited veterinarian. They're category 2, meaning they work with livestock. And for any questions, I need you to contact IDALS. Again, I don't work for IDALS. We do have folks on, so we'll go through some of that today. What I'm going to focus on is the blue part, biosecurity for exhibitions, contact info, having a plan for animals that might show clinical signs of HPAI, and having a licensed veterinarian in place. All right. Quick questions I'll just answer because we're going to transition to biosecurity now. So do we know where the aborted alpaca fetus is positive? I don't know that answer. We know that 4 out of the 18 animals tested positive. They are continuing to test animals and samples and that kind of stuff, but I don't know if the fetuses themselves were positive. Great question. And then what about the raw milk shippers, or suppliers? So again, FDA continues to talk about the safety of pasteurized milk. There's a list of bacteria that we know can be shed in raw milk. This virus is shed in very high levels in raw milk. So the recommendation is for humans and for animals, the best way for public health and food safety is pasteurized milk. Okay, great questions. All right, so a couple of those things and we'll dive into biosecurity. So one, they want you to have contact info for your dairy cattle exhibitors day of show. All right, so I know we're all registering online, getting all of our stuff in and all of that. So the day of the show, maybe it's your open class, maybe it's your 4-H'ers, your FFA kids, you need the name, their phone number that they're going to answer day of, not a home phone, if people even have those anymore, and their email address. So whatever you can collect from them to stay in contact. And then IDALS, again, listed in their order, having a licensed veterinarian in place. And what does that mean? That means they're either on site or immediately available at the exhibition to inspect dairy cattle that exhibit any signs of disease. Again, including HPAI, right? So we all know we're used to having our licensed vets be part of our county fairs and our exhibitions. So this whole HPAI piece has just added a new thing to that, to making sure that they're there to be able to respond if a exhibitor says, hey, I've got some concerns about my cow. Okay, so we're going to dive in and talk about biosecurity planning. I won't be addressing testing question. That'll be for IDALS. So again, just putting that out there. So what do we want to focus on, right? At the end of the fair, oh my gosh, I want to come home with tired kids. I want to come home with new experiences, and I don't want to come home with my critters having anything or my family having anything. So we're here to protect our cattle and protect our people. We know that animals, right, they're inspected. You got to have your health papers, that they're generally healthy, and a serious animal disease is very unusual, right? But with HPAI, they can shed that virus while still looking healthy. So that's the caveat with this whole thing. So that's why my science brain says, oh, well, let's test those cows and anything on their premises with lactating cows just to make sure that they're not at risk. So all of the biosecurity recommendations are going to focus on cleanliness, separation, and isolating after they come home. USDA put out this guidance document. They had one back in May. They just updated it and released it this past week for recommendations. And I'm going to walk through this with you guys today. So that's really where a lot of this comes from. Now, in that, we're going to focus on before, during, and after the event, stuff for exhibitors and stuff for organizers. Now, you see the dice, right? Like, you're going to roll the dice in some cases, right? So you got to realize, what risk are we willing to take? There is no zero risk when it comes to livestock, right? We know that there's bacteria that are out there. We've heard about E. coli and, you know, salmonella and all of that kind of stuff for years and years. So this is just another wrinkle in that whole paradigm of diseases in humans and animals coming together. So deciding as your fare, what risk you're willing to take. We're going to give you some ways to mitigate those risks. So before an event, contact information is, again, you'll see it comes from USDA recommendations, and I plugged in all the Iowa specific stuff. So exhibitor, state public health, and state veterinarian. And there's a 24-hour hotline for IDOLs listed there. You also need to establish a show veterinarian, understand and communicate your testing requirements to your exhibitors, write and share your biosecurity plan with those exhibitors, and then putting hand washing stations near the exit of your exhibition areas. So 5 big points that we're going to talk about in today's presentation related to that biosecurity plan. Limit commingling. I chuckle personally when I read that. I'm like, oh boy, fairs, that's what we do. But how do we do it safely? We're going to talk about that. Plan for milk from healthy cows, right? What are you going to do with that? Does it need to change? Are your protocols already good? An isolation area for sick cows. Plan for discarding their milk, right? That doesn't put it into the environment or get people exposed. So if you do have sick cows, we're going to talk about that. Limiting direct contact with the public, and then an outline for cleaning and disinfection steps. So those are the 5 things we're going to hit on. All right, number 1, limiting commingling and nose-to-nose contact. So really thinking about your barns, and we are talking about lactating dairy cattle, right? That is where the risk lies. It doesn't mean it isn't a risk in other species or other classes, but that's what the big focus is on, because they can shed so much of that virus in their milk. So can you look at your barn and go, okay, is there a way to like shift things a little bit and have some empty stalls? And then maybe that empty stall is all for tack and grooming supplies. USDA has a recommendation about tarps to prevent nose-to-nose. Last week in Iowa was 180 bazillion degrees, right? So you have to balance the risk, right? Common sense, nose-to-nose is a risk with non-herd mates. Cooking cattle and cooking people is also a risk, right? So take that and look at your barns and be like, what could we do from an airflow standpoint or anything like that? Wash racks is another place where a lot of coming together happens. So at the tie-outs, can you give space in between? If you can't, can you, get hoses hooked up so one person can hold the cow, and the water fight will ensue, right? But instead of tying up, can someone hold a cow and still get it done? Can you schedule times, right? You come at this time, this herd comes at this time. Then if you are to tie out, recommend hosing down that walls to get rid of that snot, saliva, and all that's on the ground. A disinfectant, we'll talk about those. Let it sit before the next critters come in. And then if it's a wash rack shared with all kinds of species, right? Can you wash the lactating cattle last? So just some things to think about for your operation or for your facility. So back to limiting commingling and nose to nose. So what else do we think about? You'll recognize these are a lot of Iowa pictures that have been taken. So what does that holding area look like, right? Exhibitors with class X, please come to the barn, right? So they're all standing there. Can we focus on spreading out a little bit? And then in the show ring, talking to your judges, talking to your exhibitors, like just give more space, right? Is that a possibility? So those are some things just to think about. How might it work for you? All right, number 2, plan for milk from healthy cows. So describe your removal plan, making sure you're following local and state regulations. If it's bulk milk, bucket milk, individual cow milkers don't dump anywhere besides the designated tanks. We don't want that stuff going, into compost piles or anything like that. And we know that there's limitations what can go down drains. Anyway, from environmental regulations. So, and then if you're going into a communal tank and transporting that off-site, just be very conscientious about spills and all of that, hosing that area down and disinfecting it. If you have a shared on-site parlor, really think about sanitizing those units between uses. Now, if it is all your herd, right, those individual humans need to make the decision. Are they going to do it with their own herd? Most importantly, if we're switching herds, then we need to do that as well. We also want to hose down all those surfaces where snot, urine, or milk might have come out. Spray with a disinfectant on those surfaces, let it sit, have contact time before the next group comes in. So just some things to think about for a plan for healthy cows. Sick cows. So where can you isolate sick cows? We were out on our fairgrounds last night and I'm walking around going, It's going to be a challenge. So you really got to think about what that looks like. So one thing they recommend is make sure exhibitors know what to look for, right? If they are milking cows and that milk production drops, that's a sign. The milk changes consistency, that's a sign, right? Doesn't want to eat, different than being stressed at the fair, right? Doesn't want to eat, goes off feed, and manure changes. Those are all things to look for. I put here dairy superintendent because my brain goes to our counties, but whomever is in charge of your dairy show, make sure they are notified so that the exhibit or fair veterinarian can be contacted so we can examine that animal and they will determine if it needs to be tested. CDC also recommends that any exhibit organizers stock and use NIOSH approved personal protective equipment. So masks, gloves, those kinds of things. And I'll show you a resource for that when we wrap up today. When you think about isolating those cows that are sick, think about where can I get them away from other animals, poultry, and the public, right? I've identified a risk. I want to remove them. They shouldn't share any airspace or panels, fence lines, no waters, no feeding equipment, definitely not milking equipment with other animals. Again, discarding that milk. So thinking about what would be a safe discard option, and there are things out there, right, that we can talk about. The other thing to think about is, can you just make plans to release that animal off the grounds? That puts the onus back on the exhibitor. They need to think about what to do with that animal once it comes back. Do they have a place to isolate it so as not to expose the rest of the crew? So you can see some pictures here of what that milk looks like, right? I'm going to keep showing those so people know what to look like. So again, we don't know the full picture of aerosol spread of this virus, but if you think about this as splashes from milk or splashes from urine, right? That's why we want to have them isolated. So we talk about limiting direct contact with the public. The biggest thing is like the milk a cow exhibits, very popular, awesome to do. Maybe this is a year that doesn't happen at your fair. There are simulations. This is a fancy one, but there are less expensive things that I found a bunch on YouTube that you could make something inexpensively that is just water and gives the kids or the adults the opportunity to still milk a cow without putting the actual cow and milk on display. Next, we're going to talk about hand washing options. So I just pulled this. Iowa State Extension's got this handout. It's actually under like the food safety piece of it, but same principles apply. So what are you seeing in this video? Basically, it's the old soap on a rope trick. So I want to shout out a good friend of mine up in Minnesota that was talking about this. This is a pair of tights. You could use pantyhose if you got little kids that outgrew their tights or leggings. That's all you would need is a bar of soap, drop that puppy down in here and tie it onto your hydrant. And then you've got an opportunity for your folks to wash their hands at the hydrant. So if you don't have an external system that you can set up, this might be something to think about at your fair. The National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians, NASPHV.org, has a whole set of materials for animals on exhibit. and fairs, right, fit under that. Here you see a couple of hand washing signs that you can download from their website for free. They have things in English and in Spanish. So make sure to check out nasphv.org for that information. Now we talk about clean and disinfect, having steps that need to be done. So thinking about where could virus be, right? Virus is the enemy. So is it in areas where cattle were milked? Is it in areas where cattle urinated? Is it in areas where cattle snotted on things, right? Those are your contact surfaces that you want to think about. If you're a facility that does a turn, right? Lactating dairy cattle are in for the first part and you turn it and beef cattle come into that same environment. Again, we're not seeing reports, right? But mitigating risk wherever we can. So thinking about what needs to happen in that turn for that bedding. We recommend using an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency registered disinfectant that's effective against avian influenza. So just like we have antibiotics with a label on it that says this is good for these viruses and bacteria, EPA does that for disinfectants. They make the folks that own those companies do the testing to say, can you do a label claim for this virus? There are so many or so many disinfectants effective for this virus. So the QR code there will take you to the link. Lots and lots and lots and lots of options. Avian influenza is kind of wimpy when it's not in cold or in wet areas and protected by milk or protected by manure. So some of the common names, right? Virkon S, household bleach. It comes in different concentrations. You want to make sure you're aiming for a 200 part per million solution. So you'll just kind of need to read the bottle and be like, okay, what's the concentration? And it usually tells you right there. You got to follow those label directions. There's chlorine dioxide products. There's accelerated hydrogen peroxide. I have no financial interest in any of these. So use what works best for you. You may already have it on your fairgrounds. Okay, so before we jump into biosecurity for exhibitors, I guess I'm just kind of curious, Jen, if we want to deploy the next question. When you think about your exhibition coming up July 1 or after, that's who's got to kind of follow the IDAL's recommendations on testing. Just kind of curious is, will your event, your exhibition, your fair host lactating cattle? I know there's been a lot of discussion about should we change it? We were talking a little bit before we started today, even, what that might look like for folks. So go ahead and just take a few seconds here, and Jen, I'll let you decide when enough responses have come in from our attendees today.
Sounds good. They're still coming in here. So
Awesome.
Again, the question is, will your event, exhibition, or fair host lactating cattle after July 1st? And so it looks like we're kind of slowing up with the responses. So I think I'll end the poll here and share that. So you can see that there.
Yeah, all right. So we got about 40% on yes and unsure, still deciding. So and about 21% of folks said that nope, they're not going to host them. So again, it's all about risk, right? So that's what we're here to talk about today, is how do you mitigate that risk should you choose to have lactating cows. All right, so we want to talk a little bit next about biosecurity for our exhibitors. One of the things in the IDAL's plan is it said to have a biosecurity plan. Now, you might already have a plan for pigs. You might already have a plan for poultry, and your exhibitors that show poultry and pigs might be very used to some of those things, because we've talked about this disease before, right? As it affects pigs and as it affects poultry. Now, this particular strain, right, that little fingerprint hasn't affected pigs yet, right? We're watching, but it hasn't. But we know the poultry piece of it. So I'm just curious, Jen, if we could deploy the next question. When we think about, we just covered those 5 main points, right? Do you have a plan for preventing influenza with pigs or poultry already? Because some of the things we just talked about, you might already have designed, and you might just need to add some things specifically on dairy cattle. All right. And again, we have the unsure option. So if you're not the person that deals with the plans, or you're an attendee or anything like that, go ahead and pick the unsure. But if you have something on paper already for poultry or pigs, there's a lot of similarities in things, right? The public access, the hand washing, what to do if an animal shows clinical signs and needs to either be isolated or depart. What do you do for, educating your exhibitors coming in? All right, so we've got some folks out there that have already got a start on this. So when we talk about these things, build on what you have, which makes it a little less daunting. All right, excellent. So if you've got that plan already written, you want to make sure you're sharing that with your exhibitors, which we're going to talk about next. So one of the things with exhibitors is they need to know the movement and testing requirements, right? So making sure they understand all that IDALS has put out. And if they're crossing state lines, there's federal requirements on interstate movement, right? So we know that folks go across state lines. So we want to look at that carefully too. We want our exhibitors to know the signs of HPAI in cattle. So there's a lot of things out there. We want to make sure that it's in their hands so they know what to look for. And then, right, we want healthy people coming into our fair that might be handling those animals, right? So making sure that only healthy folks, because we don't have evidence today of this virus going back to cattle from people. But there's other things out there, right, that people have that we don't want to go to pigs or poultry or anything, right? So just something to keep in mind for our exhibitors before the event. Now, what do they need to think about prior to the show? Remember, we talked about cleanliness being one of the things. Clean and disinfect anything they're going to bring to the fair. So whether that's, feed equipment, grooming equipment, milking equipment, especially any, things used to pick stalls, clean stalls, that kind of stuff. Anything that they're going to haul animals in. So that trailer, right? And themselves, as they're getting in and out of trucks and trailers and coming from home, having fair dedicated footwear, clothing, all that kind of stuff will help. Again, not just in this virus case, but there's other things, right, that we know we've dealt with for years, and E. coli and salmonella, et cetera. We don't want to bring that home either. USDA recommends, if you can, avoid transporting animals from different premises in the same trailer. And I know folks come from miles away sometimes, and you might show an animal, but you don't have a trailer. So you're traveling with your club. Just recognize if they are doing that if it's lactating animals, right? We know HPAI is found in leaked milk in the millions. We know it's found in urine, maybe not as high, but we do find it, that anybody traveling together could be exposed, right? So just keep that in mind as you're going to and from the fair. When it comes to during the event, make sure your exhibitors have got the paperwork for entry. They follow that event biosecurity plan, which you'll provide to them. The guidance for milk handling. So make sure that's spelled out in there, especially if it's different than last year, right? Sometimes that takes folks a little bit to understand. We want our exhibitors to be very selfish when it comes to their supplies. It's not usually the Iowa or the Midwest way to be selfish. But in this case, we want to make sure they're not sharing equipment, supplies, feed, and water. It happens. It absolutely happens. So clean and disinfect it if it does get used on other animals. And we want folks to know how to report and who to report to. So having those specifics in your exhibitor handout will be important if they see signs of high path, avian influenza in our cattle and any species, right? Poultry start to get sick, whatever, we want to know that. And then those isolation steps. So share that information with them so they know what to do. Milking during the event. Recommended is to use their own equipment. Right, if at all possible. There are some farms close enough to fairs that lactating cattle don't get milked on site, right? And maybe that's something to think about for your fair is could the lactating dairy cattle come in and do it at the right time of day so that they're milked at home, they show, and they go home and are milked again. So that's another option, right? Just keep things in mind, be creative if that's what you want to manage at your fair. If you have that shared on-site parlor, again, same thing, sanitize between uses. Again, those are not necessarily animal to animal in the same herd. That's up to the owner, whoever's taking care of the cows, but definitely between. And then we want to hose and disinfect things down after. After the fair. So really, really important. You don't want to bring anything home other than trophies, ribbons, tired kids, right? Isolate and observe those animals for 30 days. same thing, no shared airspace, waters, feeders, milk them last if you don't have a way to dedicate milking. And then really, really involve your herd veterinarian. They're the ones that signed that paperwork and did that testing for you ahead of time. Talk to them about, is there anything else we need to be testing for? You know, what's happened since fair, those kinds of things. So really involve your herd veterinarian throughout all this. Equipment, again, do not just take that home and start using it. Clean and disinfect it. Let it sit for a while, let it bake in the sun. UV is a very good killer of viruses, and this one in particular after things are clean. Again, milking those show cows last if you don't have a separate area to milk them. And again, contact your vet if you see any signs of decreased milk production, changes in milk consistency, decreased appetite, lethargy, fever, dehydration in the cows. What about the two-leggeds? Same kind of thing, right? Just like we talked about, local public health has monitored almost 800 people that have been exposed to known animals. We want to make sure that we're looking for that in our humans too. So for 10 days, look for flu-like symptoms. So if you develop those red eyes, right? It doesn't even have to be as bad as that, but more than an allergy eye. Fever, new cough, new sore throat, runny nose. And I love this one. I talk to the kids. It's like more tired than what we call fair fatigue, right? Just not bouncing back. So just think about it from the people side. So what steps can you take today? This is from my colleagues at the Center for Food Security and Public Health at Iowa State University. We did a lot of biosecurity stuff when I was there, and they continue to create wonderful, wonderful resources. So have that biosecurity plan and enforce it. Separate new animals and sick animals and limiting people access, cleaning pens, equipment, all of that kind of stuff are really ways to protect your herd, your two-legged herd and your four-legged herd. So we'll wrap up with some resources. CDC has got resources for organizers. You can see it on their website, Fair Organizers Information. And then again, the document I shared from USDA is available on their website as well. So both walk through a lot of what I just gave you today. The NASPHV, and this is the state public health. They've got signs, they've got protocols. I just Googled Iowa 4-H biosecurity and look, you've got this out on the web. So, you know, if you don't currently have this in your handouts, this might be something you look at and go, yeah, that's a really good start for us as well. How can I just add to it as we're building out our biosecurity plan? And then these are really good resources from Michigan State and Kansas State University, biosecurity toolkit. So there's a lot of information in there. And one thing we didn't talk about that's in here, if you have a case and something happens, media might be involved. So how do you talk to the media about some of this stuff? Right. So there's media toolkits in here as well, if something were to happen at your county or your exhibit. And then our friends at Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship have all kinds of biosecurity information. They've got stuff specific to this virus that we're dealing with in dairy cattle, links to resources for poultry, and just a really good wealth of information. Dr. Kaizen's phone number, and that phone number will actually get you to the staff there. All great folks that can answer your questions, as well as the 24-hour hotline. So with that, I want to thank you for making time out of your busy schedule today to talk about this, and I will turn it back over to Fred and Jen and the Iowa State Extension crew to field some questions.
And Danelle, you have one other poll question. Did you want me to launch that?
Oh, yes, thank you. Appreciate that, Jen. Yep, this is just kind of curious what might help you guys after seeing what some of the resources are. And you know, again, you can pick. Looks like it's a single choice, maybe. I don't know. I'm kind of new at polls. So it looks like you get to pick one. Sorry. So maybe pick what might help you the most. That will definitely help us as, you know, fair season's kicking in and identifying some things that we might need to develop or get it to folks that can develop.
Yeah, it looks like you're only able to select one, but if there are other areas, please put those in the chat as well, because there might be other ones that we didn't list here, but I'll end that. And it looks like biosecurity plan template with the 5 main areas presented stands out as a resource that they're looking for.
Great. I thought that might be an important one for folks, so. All right, well, thank you for the opportunity and welcome questions.
Okay,
A
we've
couple
got,
questions in the chat box. The first one, or at least one of them, the dairy beef shown as market steers. Do you want to address that?
So
Actually, we've got-
anything related to testing, we're gonna turn over to our IDOLS folks, and I think I saw Dr. Rumsey on. And
I
Dr.
think-
Kaisen's on, so.
Yep.
Awesome.
Guess it's, so dairy needs to be tested if they're on herds with lactating dairy cows.
so if that market, if the dairy beef steer is coming from a premise with lactating dairy cattle, it would fall under the bulk tank testing requirement.
If they're dairy cattle or cross cattle.
And what if they came from a dairy farm, but it's 30 days later now?
So our rule defines that if they're coming from the premise where there are lactating dairy cattle. So if they're not coming from the premise where there are lactating dairy cattle, then no, they would not need to be tested.
So even if they go to a different farm for 2 days before the fair, it wouldn't have to be tested.
Well, if we're gonna,
we're getting a lot of questions like that, so I think it needs to be
Sure.
addressed.
Sure, I guess. Well, I guess the intent is not to circumvent, try and get around testing and moving them to a different location. So we didn't put a specific timeline on the testing how long they have to be off of a premise with lactating dairy cattle. So that's why we said if they're originating from a premise with lactating dairy cattle on the herds, and disease exposure is part of the issue there.
I think the question is more so, and Victoria said this as well, there's a lot of fairs with bucket calf shows, and they may have been away from the farm for various amounts of time. And so maybe this is a question for Dr. Kaisen, maybe this is a question for Danelle. If we have a county that's wondering about the best way to handle this, the bucket calves in particular, what advice or advice and or requirements would you let them know?
So for the exhibition requirements, if they are dairy bucket calves and they are not on a premise where they're lactating dairy cows, that they are on a separate premise, then there would not be any testing requirements. Our normal exhibition requirements would require them to have a CVI unless they're going to a 4-H or FFA show, which exempts them from a CVI. So they are required to have a CVI, and according to the exhibition order, would be within 7 days of going to the exhibition.
And then Danelle, we have a lot of county representatives on, and you saw a lot of the folks replying to your poll saying that they were unsure about certain things. We have people here from county fairs that are trying to figure out what they should be doing or best practices specific to these bottle calves. What recommendations would you make to them as they're trying to think through that, if they want to go above and beyond what Dr. Kaisen just mentioned?
Certainly. So no zero risk, right? I think everybody's got to kind of determine, does my county have 15 bucket calves? Do they have 50 bucket calves? Do they have 2, right? There's a difference, right? When we start talking about how many animals we're going to potentially bring together. So based on the science, we know that cows can shed into their milk before they show clinical signs. So we might have the opportunity to move virus around if we don't know the status of those milk cows from that farm, right? So if the fair realizes that based on where we're pulling animals from and how we're supporting our community, that might be too big of a risk, they might consider adding that test requirement in. As we shared, the fairs can do more stringent. They can't ever be less than the state or the feds, but they can be more. So thinking about what that risk might be for their county fair. Then when those animals come in, housing, right? Or is it they come in, do what they need to do that day, and they leave again? So one of the things we said in vet school was the solution to pollution is dilution, right? So the more concentrated we have and the more volume of virus or whatever bacteria we're worried about, the higher chance for exposure, right? So if there's ways that your county can just sit down and be like, okay, how many might be coming in? Where can we house them? Could we modify things a little bit differently? Could we add a testing requirement that would reassure our fair board, that would reassure our animal owners? Then that might be the best thing for you. The next county might have a whole other approach, right? So it is no one easy answer. You got to kind of decide for your fair what you can manage. How, turnover, do you have a way to isolate if something does get sick? So.
And I think we have a little bit of a question here about where the line is between lactating dairy cattle and lactating beef cattle, maybe, for crossbreds in particular. What counts as so Katrina asked specifically, she's thinking about Normandy or Normandy crosses. If we have bucket calves that are coming from farms with no lactating cows, but we could be considered a dairy breed / R crossed. Dr. Kaizen, do you have any insight on the requirements for a dairy cattle versus a beef cattle versus a crossbred?
Well, the order applies to dairy cows. So if you're milking cows for business, I mean, it's probably that would fit in the category of lactating cows.
What about dairy calves for a Pee-wee dairy show that do not stay at the fair, but they're coming from a lactating herd?
They would still fall under the requirements of the exhibition order.
What is the, I don't know if this is a question for Danelle or Jeff or Dr. Kaizen or if somebody from VDL is here on the call. Milk testing is a requirement. What kind of turnaround time can we expect from the lab? I assume you can't submit a sample the day before and expect a positive test back on time, but as folks are trying to plan for getting this testing done, what recommendations do you have for them?
Well, I would encourage them to contact the lab and make sure they understand what the testing turnaround could be. That's why we've also allowed 7 days in advance of the exhibition to get the testing done, because we felt that should be long enough for everyone to plan to make sure you can get the testing done before the exhibition.
Dr. Kaizen, we have a question on proximity of dairy and poultry at the fair. Do you have any recommendations on that?
We do not have any direct recommendations on that. Obviously, that our main emphasis of the order was to the best of all our abilities is to make sure that dairy cattle coming to the exhibitions are negative within our testing parameters. So hopefully we're first off ensuring that the dairy animals are safe coming to the exhibitions. But obviously, if there's some separation, adds in an extra level of safety. So any type of separation would be wise.
I know Danelle mentioned this, but let's go over again, as we do have a question. Can lactating cows affect lactating goats?
We don't have reports today of lactating goats with H5N1, this particular strain. They have the opportunity, right? They have a mammary gland with cells that replicate. So there's a potential, but to date, we don't have a report of this going from lactating dairy cows to lactating dairy goats, or lactating beef cows for that matter. I know beef cows have come up, cow-calf pairs and that kind of stuff, but this virus makes us go like this a lot. We're scratching our heads, like why certain things and why not other things. And well, this is a dairy, well, it's not dairy month, but I love dairy. So if you think of all of this stuff that we just threw at you as a block of Swiss cheese, right? And on one end of the Swiss cheese is the virus, and on the other end is a dairy cow, right? So that virus is like, cool, there's a hole. It hit a wall. Huh. That first wall is testing to go, is there even virus in this milk sample? Because if there's not, you've just prevented one of the biggest risks, right? If you don't have virus, it doesn't put any critters at the fair at risk, right? So number one, blockade is that testing piece. Everybody has different levels of risk tolerance. Testing is free. Did I mention that? Free, free. $0, 0 cents. It's free. You still have to pay your vet because they have to come out and they have time and they have supplies, but free. Free, free. So stopgap number one, test. No virus. Huh, cool. There's still other things that can get to a dairy cow that might be at a fair, but it might not be that virus, right? So if you have virus and it is undetected, what's another thing you can do? Well, maybe not get dairy cattle touching each other while they're at the fair. No nose to nose, right? So that's a biosecurity step. And then if there is some in the environment, what do? You clean and disinfect. Right? And then, oh gosh, what if it could get to poultry? Well, if we put some distance between the poultry barn and the dairy barn, and we talk to people about, not walking through and all of that stuff and touching each other, that's another option, right? So there's all of these holes in a block of Swiss cheese to get to that dairy cow. And each one of those is a prevention practice. You can decide you have one prevention practice, testing, and then requiring it, even maybe above and beyond what IDALS is asking. That's a prevention practice. And then you've got all these other things because humans screw up biosecurity every single day, right? And the public doesn't understand. So what other things can you do to protect agriculture? Because that's really what it's all about. So I'll get off my soapbox.
That's a really great way to picture that, Danelle. I appreciate that visual. And we can eat cheese regardless if it's still June Dairy Month or not. Just to clarify on some of the stuff we were just talking about, ISU Veterinary Field Services put in the chat that lab tests are usually 24 to 48 hour turnaround depending on when the samples arrive to the lab. So try to submit earlier in the week if possible. More days up ahead would allow for more insured sample results. So I know we have a couple people in the chat here are really concerned because fairs are happening already, and some of us are thinking about fairs as soon as next week. So yes, these tests are available. Our field services lab has been. Our diagnostic lab has been doing these tests, and as Danelle said, it's $0. It is free, so please be preparing to take these samples as soon as we can. Michelle is asking for some clarification. They have vets checking the animals as they arrive in the fairgrounds. If dairy animals come from a non-milking facility, do those animals need a health paper in hand, or is the vet check acceptable at the fair upon arrival? Again, I think we've talked a lot about they're not coming from a facility with lactating cattle on them. They're kind of exempt from some of these testing requirements. And so in this case, is that correct, that vet check at the fair on arrival is acceptable?
Well, they still need a health paper. If it's required,
Right.
They have a health paper. There has to be a health paper written. So I guess if there's arrangements being made at the local county fair that the veterinarian is going to write health papers for each of the exhibitors at the fair, that's up to the veterinarian. But that veterinarian needs to have an understanding of the herd health, where the animals are coming from. So it's up to that veterinarian whether they're going to be willing to write health papers at the exhibition before they enter the exhibition.
We have a question on, will a negative test be accepted from a creamery, or does it need to come from a testing lab?
So our order requires that the testing be done at ISU or another lab as approved by IDALS. So the tests need to be run to the ISU diagnostic lab unless there's a request to run them at a different lab. And I'm not aware of any creameries that are running high path avian influenza PCR testing.
Is there a radius from farm to farm for the testing? So we've talked about, if animals are coming from a premises that has lactating dairy cattle on it, they must be tested. If animals are coming from a farm that does not have lactating cattle on it, they do not need to be tested, according to the order. Where do we draw a line around premises? So if I'm raising my calves across the street, does that still count? If they're in the next town over, does that count? Is there any sort of guidance about what is or is not a premises?
So again, we define premise where they're together. I mean, I think some of the pieces, Danelle mentioned it here just a few minutes ago, the intent, and I also mentioned it, the intent of the order was to allow exhibitions to occur for dairy cattle to come. And the intent is to make this as safe for everyone and not bring animals that could be infected with HPAI to an exhibition and potentially spread it, especially to the poultry at the exhibitions. So we've not said in the order that a premises is a premise is separate if it's across the road or down the road or somewhere else. Some of those determinations need to be made by the exhibitor working with their veterinarian, signing the health papers, understanding if there's shared labor, anything that's shared back and forth. If the premise is completely separate, there's no connections to a lactating dairy herd. I think those are some of the considerations that need to be taken into consideration, because what we're trying to do is make sure that exhibitions continue in a manner that we're not spreading disease. We have, in the last several weeks, and why this order went into place, have found new dairies that are infected in the state of Iowa. And it appears this disease is still continuing to spread. So again, what we want to make absolutely sure is happening, that dairy exhibitions can continue to happen in Iowa, but in a manner that we're not going to spread disease. So the short answer is it's not defined that it says a separate premise is down the road a quarter of a mile or greater, or it's across the road.
Yep.
But again, and the question a minute ago, if I move them off site for 2 days, is that off site? I hope the intent that everybody's going to understand here is we're allowing exhibitions to continue, but we are also wanting everybody to do the right thing here and making sure that animals come to exhibitions that are healthy and we're not going to spread disease. And that should occur no matter if it's dairy, swine, beef, whatever it is, but that's the intent of the order.
Yeah, we want to be good neighbors, obviously, to other dairy producers as well as to our poultry neighbors as well. So I like that sentiment that you expressed, Dr. Kaizen, there. We do have a couple questions that kind of lump together, and just for clarification, so that we have some questions about allowing the public to walk through the barns to view cattle. Can we commingle dairy cattle and beef cattle in the same barn? Poultry, we talked a little bit about the poultry proximity, but just to reiterate, there's nothing in the order that would prevent any of this from happening. And so that's what Danelle is talking about is at your exhibition or at your fair, you may choose to use some different biosecurity practices depending on the risk that's associated. Danelle, anything, or Dr. Kaizen, anything to add to that?
Go ahead. So I'll let yield in a minute here. So no, I mean, I guess again, what we know today, dairy cattle can be infected with this virus that occurred in a spillover event from wild birds into dairy, that it's continued to replicate in dairy cattle. It's been moved across the United States geographically via dairy cows. Once it's gotten into other areas, it is spread for some reason laterally from dairy cattle into poultry, and we're not sure if it could be going backwards. We've not shown yet any beef cattle being affected by this. That's not to say it could not happen, and all biosecurity measures should be put in place. But if we're doing our best to make sure dairy cattle are coming negative to the exhibition, there's no prohibitions from housing them next to each other, any type of separation, and even within exhibitors, whether they bring beef cattle and would be a paradigm shift from how this has been done for years, but any type of separation between exhibitors and whatever livestock they have is a good thing to practice, but not always easily done.
Ditto.
Danelle, we have a question on how should, and you mentioned this a little bit, but reiterate, how should we manage requests from the media for interviews regarding this topic?
So I guess from an extension standpoint, I'm gonna guess you have some type of media request protocol within your counties. I don't know. I don't want to tell you how to do your county level business by any means, but there's information out. I tried to share all the public resources that are there, shared those guides for fairs, and there's information in there on media inquiries. So I'd really encourage anybody planning an exhibit, fair, event, whatever, grabbing some of those resources and pulling out the nuggets that best help you. And then I put my contact information up there as well. If folks have some specific questions, I'm glad to field them.
Very good. Going back to Dr. Kaizen, he offers up his phone number pretty regularly. So if you have questions, that seems to be an invitation that we ought to utilize. Also, your specialist, if it's a question on the biosecurity or clarification, obviously we are always available to the counties. Any other questions coming in?
We did have one that I think kind of got filtered in along the way about testing requirements. Sorry. We have somebody asking, their show is a single source show, so they only get cows from a single dairy or cattle from a single dairy. Do these rules and regulations still apply if all the cattle are coming from the same source?
If it's an exhibition, they're coming to an exhibition to show cattle, yes.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And I hope everybody heard today, as we've been discussing, that we have good intentions from the state vet's office and from everybody involved here. We just want to make sure exhibitors stay safe. We want to make sure our cattle stay safe. We want to make sure the public stays safe, and our exhibitors in the poultry world as well. So really appreciate Danelle and Dr. Kaizen's contributions this morning.
We've got a comment about a simpler form. And I think, Celine Beggs is online. I believe that she's putting something together for the 4-H. And I believe, Celine, that's dairy specific though, right?
Sorry, I couldn't find all my buttons. At this point, yes, it is dairy specific. But I think a lot of that information, reach out and we can help connect you, or if you have that question, there are a lot of others that have that question too regarding testing. So we're here at the state office to help. I know Fred and the dairy team have also helped answer a lot of questions, dairy specific. So we'll get it figured out.
Any other questions? We have, in fact, recorded this, and the recording will be available at the ISU Dairy Team website. And we did not ask for registrations, but we will try to respond to location if anyone has difficulty, but that's kind of the first thing. In addition to that, we will have links to the documents that Danelle mentioned. So expect that in the next couple of days. I'm putting a big load on Jen Bailey, my cohort there in Eastern Iowa. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, so Fred, it'll also be on our YouTube channel as well. So if people go out to our YouTube channel and follow that, we'll get it posted there. We also do keep a high path link on our Extension Dairy Team page, and we try to keep that updated with resources, biosecurity resources, anything coming from IDOLS, any of those news releases. So we can definitely go there as well. I see Gail just put that in the chat, so thanks.
Sometimes Jen has to remind me about YouTube because it's a generational thing there. So
I just got a question about how much does one sample cost?
So I guess, the testing is paid for at ISU and the lab fees are all, the test itself to run at ISU is paid for. So I can't answer what a veterinarian charges for writing a health paper coming to the farm, but the lab fees, the lab testing, once the sample gets to the lab, there are no fees.
And producers can apply for USDA assistance with those fees, for the veterinary fees. Is that correct, Dr. Kaizen?
Yes.
And is that only commercial producers? So if they have a bucket bottle calf where they're not so it's any and all?
So they can apply. It's USDA money. So the best thing to do is ask them directly. But it's our understanding that it's not defined as commercial or non-commercial, but can't speak and guarantee that would not be some restriction.
okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. I want to thank everybody for attending, and you have lots of contact information. If more questions come up, don't be afraid to contact the IDOLS folks, Dr. Jeff Kaizen, Danelle, or any of your extension dairy specialists. With that, unless I see somebody flagging me, we're going to go ahead and leave the meeting. Thank you again.